Is that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm in here. Yeah, this seems to work. I'll give a bit of a story kind of background of what this piece is. The last time I performed this was in a noise venue, a kind of punk rock show at Coaxial, where I had the sounds of a database deleting itself, increasing in noise until it kind of washed out my voice. I won't subject all of you to that. Today, this will be the proper academic version. But yeah, I'll give you a bit of background on what this piece is and what it's doing, and then maybe talk just at the end how I'm seeing this as a kind of model for both pedagogy and creative production. It's called Bricked, and it's mostly called Bricked because I was thinking about this house, which I can just grab right here. It's called Stone Manor. It was a house that my stepmother, very well intentioned, had rented for my family to take a last trip with my grandmother, who had recently been diagnosed with dementia. This is Grandma Jean, wearing a beautiful rose outfit. I'll just bring her over here so you can see Jean in the house. Put her in the yard. So we wanted to have a kind of last trip, and we'd taken in my whole youth these trips up to the Oregon coastline where my grandmother lived, and so we wanted to recreate that, going to the redwoods. I can't see everyone. I'm just going to move some stuff. I'll tell you about this. So we'd taken these trips up to the Oregon coastline, and we wanted to reproduce that. However, we stayed in this place. Actually, here's a good caption. Is Wilderville a family-friendly place to stay? To Wilderville in this somewhat haunted house called Stone Manor, which was a kind of vacation property, I think, for the Stone family, who had built this house really, I think, as a kind of cabinet of curiosities for the various things that they had encountered, like as a storage overflow. Here's their living room. You can see. So they had these rooms that were just full of objects, disorienting objects, obviously not ideal for somebody suffering from dementia, from taxidermied reindeer. There was a floating, I don't know, there's like a floating jellyfish somewhere. I don't know where it put that. Might have been lost. But they did have a real penchant for Marilyn Monroe, who was sort of all over the house. And also like a tremendous amount, for some reason, of Betty Boop. What are you doing down here, Betty? Oh. There's got to be a better way of doing that. All right, let's put Betty here for my grandma. Sorry, Grandma. Okay. So surrounded by these disorienting objects, here's a boat. Trying to think about my grandmother's experience and her disorientation in this space, I decided to take a photograph of every single object in this house so that I could tell the story of this place and use it to produce something like a comic book. I didn't initially think it was going to be a VR installation, and I'm still working on this as maybe something can play both on a desktop but in a headset, to produce a kind of comic that would be able to tell the story of my grandma, of this lovely woman. Let's see, I'll put her kind of clear some space for us. Yeah, no, and I'm here with my grandma. So I wanted to use it as an opportunity to think about my grandmother, to think about this bizarre trip that we were all on, this kind of transformative moment, but also to contemplate the intertwining of human memory systems and digital memory systems, our cultural memory archives, which are increasingly digitized and subject to other forms of forgetting. Forms of forgetting, I think, are quite different than human forgetting, things like link rot, for example, or the termites that might eat wood, termites that might deteriorate digital images. In Brick, I'm thinking about human memory systems alongside technical systems, but I felt like it was really nice to use this kind of virtual space as a way to tell this story and to rearrange the objects as one might rearrange objects in a database, in a home, or I think indeed like in your mind. What I didn't know at the time, where did he go? He's always It was also the last trip I got to take with my father, who passed in 2021 during COVID. I think I have one tiny dad over here. There he is. Hey, Dad. A tiny father. He's carrying a. Brent, will you take my dad? Oh, we went too far. So he's running away over there toward Brent. So I like this as a kind of like performance tool. So you can write things. I think usually when I perform this, I wander around, grab various texts that I've written or sampled. Of course, our writing tools are working on our thoughts, famously uttered by Nietzsche and echoed by Emerson, thinking about how the kinds of writing technologies we use don't just change based on what kind of aesthetic affordances they give us, but actually change the way that we think. So I was finding, this is from a study on black aging. Genre is a hopscotch grid drawn in the dirt that smears and fades its substance through use. I'll let Marilyn say that. That feels nice. So as you can see, I'm kind of wandering around. Texts like medical studies, and there's a lot of people from the medical professions here. Plasma proteomic profiles predict future dementia in healthy adults, as well as digital theory, some neologisms, soft lac, rotware, the idea of spaces that both accumulate and deteriorate over time. But all of this really just being a kind of live composition tool, as you can see, for improvisation, but to be surrounded by text that one might use. I was very interested in the metaphor of the brick, both because, as I said, we're in Stone Manor, so literally surrounded by bricks, but a bricked device is, of course, a device that no longer works. Sometimes verb, yeah, I bricked the router because I forgot about adding in the new access list. The rear view mirror of some imagined universal. Bibliographic studies, I love this line. Unlike the paper saint, whose visage begs destructive kisses, digital objects only persist with continuous devotion. I'll remove this termite. And this is a real thing. There's all these manuscripts of saints whose faces were missing. You were like, why are all these saints missing? But it turned out that they were missing because people like to kiss their saints. So paper, it deteriorates the more you use it. Books that are most used are the ones that disintegrate. With digital materials, it's exactly the opposite, right? So if you don't load a web page, it's not going to get archived by archive.org or other sites. So playing with the kind of ironies of use in various kinds of formats. In this language suitable to dementia resides the nowhere land, where usual pathways to the concepts of humanness or colonial agency implicitly forged through gender difference break down. I don't think Grandma would say that, but colonial objects. And apples all too nice to have. I like this line. Becoming machine, memory, wiped clean. Already slipping into dementia, she moves about the library, nested in folder hierarchies, late at night. The average life of a web page is about 100 days. A wastebasket is simply an instruction for the deletion of data. Data does not, for instance, just sit and rot as things do in an actual wastebasket. Computational operations are radically obscured by the skeuomorphic bin. One last one. Chandeliered fortresses of reluctance and web formations and huddling dementia for an afternoon nap. So I like to give a kind of demo of this, both to give a sense of what the poem looks like. Get this out of the way. What is this? I don't need this. So you can get a sense of what the compositional space looks like. I've built this in Unity, so you can also do this as multiplayer. I'm working with the conceptual comics artist from Greece, Ilan Manouach, to build a kind of dialogic space where we can compose together. So forms of collaborative writing, but also the kind of free arrangement in a real space, being able to play with dimension in comics, which is typically more of a flat format. The infinite arrangements and moldability that you can take texts, put them in relationship to each other, put them in relationships with a variety of images. This is, of course, a small set of about 1,000 objects that I captured for this project. But I also want to release this as a tool for other people to fill with their own images and data sets. So you can imagine use cases ranging from, here I'm interested in comics, but not everyone is. You could think about presentation formats, being able to use this as a way to move about a room with slides. You could think about this, oh, I like the recursion effect. But to bring a bit of levity and play into presentation formats, which are typically bound up with two-dimensional formats and screens, trying to find ways to open up these spaces for play and performance, but also to kind of like linger with things in a different way, or like feel them in a different way. I always get emotional when I come into this space. Of course, it's loaded for me personally. But it also, I realized in playbacks that there's something really uncanny about being in a virtual space with other live people, where I'm having my own experience that you're all not having. Like I'm actually like in this, I am the yak right now. I'm like in this space and touching these things, but you're seeing me just kind of wandering around in what is otherwise empty. It's full of images that I'm walking through, but I found that somehow I'd actually choreographed the same movements I observed my grandmother doing while lost in the living room at the Stone Manor. So these are all things that I'm bearing in mind as I compose this. It's under development, and I'm actively looking for collaborators with most of the projects I'm working on, and welcome any questions or thoughts that I can share about this project. Thank you.
Man, what a great presentation. Thinking of the research that's shown cognitive benefits for the aging in reconstructing their life stories, it seems like this might take that to a whole other level. Have you looked into that at all, or considered those types of studies to see if maybe this has a added benefit to slow cognitive decline?
That's a wonderful idea. No, I really love that. I've looked into quite a bit of various kinds of therapeutic uses of VR. And this is early stages, and I've been developing this to think about dementia directly, but certainly I think it's a really smart idea that if, say, my grandmother were surrounded by pictures of her youth, my other grandmother just celebrated her 90th birthday, and she's undergoing similar things, but she had images of her youth all over the celebration hall, and was more present on that day than we had seen her in a very long time. I know that's a common occurrence. So I think that there's absolutely a VR use case for being able to arrange and move objects, but to be surrounded by objects that one loves, especially I think for people who are traveling, say, or in a disorienting space. Like imagine this as a kind of anchor point where everyone's at.
That'd be great. We should talk more.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
I'll just add to that from the VMed conferences that I've attended. They have some really great patient stories that they've shared, and I remember one video specifically. It was an elderly woman who was essentially, she looked like she was catatonic because she wasn't engaging, and she was just complete total care, and the caregiver was just taking care of her, just essentially moving her body. And they learned from their daughter that she used to play music all her life. I forget if she was a pianist or something, and they played very similar music that she used to play, and got her to somehow trigger something in her memory. And then in the video that they showed, they skipped to the part where all of a sudden someone who was like in bed looking like she was immobile and she wasn't engaging, she wasn't talking at all, to she was sitting on a computer, not a computer, on a piano, wearing a bathrobe and just playing notes from memory, which, you know, the whole crowd was just emotional. But that's like a one person use case, but I think it could be applied to a lot of different scenarios.
Yeah, I think, increasingly, it's one of the things that I think about a lot in my classes, the increasing fidelity of a lot of these systems, or like the increasing immersion, where the frame rate up until very recently was too low for people to get very disoriented or nauseous quite quickly. Both increased frame rates and increased fidelity, I think that there is a kind of like trickiness. Part of why I was interested in the question of Parkinson's, the patients that you're working with, in terms of like onboarding them. So like, if it's not fidelitous enough, like if it doesn't have that reality effect, if it doesn't have that frame rate, then it produces more disorientation than verisimilitude. And so I think like it's one of the things to look forward to in the next couple of years, or really I think just at that turning point in VR where the verisimilitude it has a kind of reality effect that it didn't have beforehand, and a kind of lightness too, where the headset isn't weighing one down.
Hey Danny.
Yeah.
So it was great to see the project. I read a little about it, but seeing it really kind of gives me insight into what you're exploring, and it reminded me of, when you hear about these memory geniuses who just remember decks of cards and they can remember the sequence. And I remember a story where one of the people who are great at this basically memorizing the cards in kind of a spatial labyrinth that they walk around.
Memory palace.
Yeah. So I'm just curious because I have a phone and a laptop loaded with so many images that I'm probably never going to look at. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, like, how this could be used, maybe just from a, almost like a day-to-day basis where people offload their content and actually touch it and move it around and put things which are important to themselves. And I think it's really interesting from an archive perspective.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful idea, Gareth. I really love that. I've been thinking of this. So I have a book coming out this June called The Little Database that's about what do we do with our small collections on our hard drive. So things that are like way too small and too idiosyncratic for big data, but like way too big to read, like 10,000 photographs on my iPhone. Like, how do we do that? And then most of my answer is like forms of like creative remix, forms of curating, forms of like producing these spaces of meaningful engagement. Like what's meaningful to a human isn't the same thing as meaningful to a computer. I will say as a memory tool, one of I often refer back to Vint Cerf, the founder of the internet, who very famously told us that if you want to save anything, you should print it out. We have this kind of misconception that like digital formats have more longevity than some of our old-fashioned material artifacts. And so on a conceptual level in this piece, I'm also thinking about that engagement of the material with the digital, where the digital objects, as we've seen, are like, disappearing at a very rapid rate. The internet is disappearing more quickly than we can catalog what's been lost. And so like all of those losses, and we keep using, we're like, we're so susceptible to technological metaphors for how our minds work or how our memories work. And so there's a lot of like rich metaphoricity that I'm trying to draw out of people either thinking in one direction about how human minds or human memories might best be mimicking certain kinds of digital cultural memory systems versus these like older archival systems. And so I'm trying to find a thing that like sits in an uneasy space between the two. And I think like VR spaces are always that uncanny space where it's like, for me, they feel kind of real. And I'm not touching the images, but I am touching my own fingers. So it does feel kind of like I'm grabbing something. And I think that like brings all of those like paradoxes and kind of like weird ironies of the digital and the real meeting each other into conversation with each other.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
The other use case that I'll add that I think could benefit from this is patients who are stuck in the hospital for, long periods of time, and whether they be, older or younger, they just have nowhere to go. They're not allowed to step outside of the hospital. We have to get them patio privileges, and that's, based on approval status and how medically stable you are. And sometimes they're there for months at a time, waiting on an organ transplant or waiting for their counts to recover after getting cancer treatment. So they are just so impatient from waiting, and all they have is like a phone, a tablet, a TV, and FaceTiming people and like whoever comes to visit.
Yeah.
So they, start to accumulate things in their room to try to make it homey. But I think having something like this would allow them to explore it even more, or even just have like a big display of like an image or a viewpoint that takes them to their happy place, or just personalizing it.
Yeah, and there's nothing more lonely than being on FaceTime. God, I hate FaceTime. So I like really got into VR during COVID, where I use it for all of my exercise. So all my exercise has been an app called Supernatural, where you go and like, you're on top of Mount Everest, or you're on the moon, or you're whatever, on a beach, and you're like boxing or swinging some bats around. And I think like for my own mental health, it was like tremendously useful to like have these like other spaces, and also to be surrounded by other people. Like Brendan, who lived in New York, and I still hold on to. Like I think that there's still like really meaningful things you can do in these virtual spaces that we did by necessity in 2020 that I think are still really valuable to think about now.
So I have actually two questions, but the first one is rather straightforward. It's when you get to a configuration of your poetry and the images, how do you save it? I mean, how do you persist that? So like if you wanted to come back to it.
Yeah, so the game version, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll say, so the game version has a function that it's like a camera. So basically you're arranging these into the right arrangement, and then the camera disintegrates the images. But it also captures that image that produces a print-on-demand book. So the idea is at the end, like you would play this game, and when you beat the game, you would get a full book of the arrangements you produced in the game. Does that make sense? So after the arrangements, there's a button press. If you press two buttons, it snaps a trigger, and like a camera, it just captures whatever you're seeing in that moment.
And that's how you save that particular session.
Yeah, and you can do video recording as well, but I like the idea of like trying to produce a polished, composed object at the end of it. I feel like I'm taking too much time.
Obviously, we will all love to.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the questions.
Can I ask a super quick